Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so very much for coming for this special presentation today in celebration of our exhibition, The Power of Photography, which is sponsored in part by Nellie and Robert Gibson and NYCM Insurance and organized by the Photographic Traveling Exhibitions of Los Angeles. We're thrilled to have this incredible exhibition here at the museum this summer. My name is Kevin Gray. I'm the manager of arts education here at Fenimore Art Museum. And before I get to my formal introduction for our wonderful speaker today, just a couple quick reminders. Please silence your cell phones. There will be a question and answer session to follow the presentation. There'll also be a book signing, which I'll tell you more about at the end of the talk. And if anybody does need restrooms, of course, there is the men's room directly outside the door here. Ladies' room is across the way towards our study center. In presenting our speaker today, I wanted to start with a quick quote from a photographer who is one of my favorites, and who is featured in the exhibition here at the museum, and that is Robert Adams, who is not only an incredible photographer, but also an amazing writer on the photographic arts. And he says, "Your own photography is never enough. Every photographer who has lasted has depended on other people's pictures too. Photographs that may be public or private, serious or funny, but that carry with them a reminder of community." And through his collecting, Peter Fetterman has assembled an incredibly powerful and important community of photographs and photographers, spanning over 150 years of photographic history. And this exhibition, built from his collection, is one that truly reinforces the power of photography. Peter Fetterman, initially a filmmaker and collector, has helmed the Peter Fetterman Gallery in Santa Monica, California for over 35 years. He is the author of The Power of Photography, which was released in 2022, published by ACC Art Books, and is, of course, available in our museum shop. He is also the author of Woman, a Celebration, another collection of photographs, and he is also the author of a book about Cornell Kappa. He is here from Santa Monica, California this weekend. We're thrilled to have him. I cannot wait to hear some of the stories. I've already heard some of them because I've had a chance to spend some time with him over the past couple of days. I think you're going to have a wonderful time. And without any further ado, Peter Fetterman, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Kevin, and thank you to all your colleagues for really doing a beautiful installation of the work and having to figure out, like, the madness in my mind of 122 photos. How do we make them flow? How do we give them the meaning that I think, I wanted them to have? But it's a really beautiful installation, and this is one of the most extraordinary museums I've been to in the world, and I've been to a lot of them. It's just so beautiful, and it's a gem. So I'm very humbled to be here, and I think you've done me proud, Kevin and Julia and Chris and everybody. But more important, I think you've done the photographers proud. How did I get here? Well, I have to pinch myself because the notion of me being a collector growing up was maybe parallel to me being able to fly to the moon. I was born in a tenement in the East End of London. My parents both left school when they were 13. They came from very kind of troubled, struggle backgrounds, and they worked hard, they were decent people, but I grew up in an environment where I never saw a book, I never saw any kind of image. So the fact that I'm here talking to you now, quote, as a collector, in my mind, a collector is somebody who comes from enormous wealth. They're a Carnegie, they're a Mellon, they're a Huntington, they're a J.P. Morgan. And the fact that I'm here talking to you about collecting is kind of insane. So I have to pinch myself. And so So the power of photography came together, this project came together at the beginning of COVID. You know, I was sitting at my kitchen table going crazy. My gallery was closed. I couldn't go anywhere. Everything was shut down. You know, big part of my life was always traveling, being Billy Graham, an evangelist for photography. We would do, at the height, maybe 12 art fairs a year. So I felt a bit like being in a rock and roll band. You know, there was another show, another fair in another city. You know, you're on the road. And hopefully I behaved quite well. I wasn't like Keith Moon from The Who. I didn't throw televisions out of bedroom windows. But I did wake up, and I couldn't quite figure out where I was that day because it was so intense. So I'm sitting there, and the words, the power of photography, came into my brain. And I thought, okay, I'm just going to come up with an image. For 5 days, I'm going to take an image that meant something to me, write a few words about it, about how I came across this image, the maker of this image, and I'll send it out, and I'll try it for 5 days, and then I would pack it in, because nobody would really care. But for some bizarre reason, these little missives every day communicated to people, and it seemed to make them feel better and give them hope. So somebody would send the image to their Aunt Lily in Des Moines, and Aunt Lily would send another message to her best friend Betsy in California, and it just kind of went viral, I suppose. I hate that word, but that's what happened. And then all these publishers started to call me and say, why don't you put it in a book, because it seems to make people happy in this very desperate time. And I have one client who's actually a big shot at the World Bank, and she sent it to a European prime minister. And she told me that this prime minister said it was the only email they received every morning that they looked forward to. So I was on something, and then I wanted to put together a museum show, and here we are. So this is, I think it's now its 5th venue, but I must say it's the best venue. It's the best layout of the image. So you're also lucky to be living near to this space. It's a magical space. So never take it for granted, especially in this era where we have insane people shutting down cultural institutions, right? So, but let's go back. I was like a little kid. I had to get out of my little apartment because I knew there was a big world out there. And I discovered cinema as a young kid. I was like the little kid in Cinema Paradiso, seeing every single movie I could see. And libraries were was a holy place for me. So I used to bury myself in libraries. And one day I come across this book called A Vanished World, and I've never really looked at photographs. They'd never really impacted me, but within this book there was this following image. And there was something about this photo that totally obsessed me, brought me in, powerfully moved me, and I loved its title. It's called Sarah, the Only Flowers of Her Youth. So this was taken in the 30s in the Warsaw Ghetto. This little kid had never seen flowers. She'd never been outside of this room. And her father painted images of flowers on the wall where they're all living in one room, just to give her some kind of sense and maybe hope, false as it was, that there's a world outside of the situation. And the photographer was a man called Roman Vishniak. And Roman was born in Russia, had moved to Germany, and he knew what was going on in Germany in the 30s. And what he wanted to do is to preserve the memory of his people. He knew what was going to happen, But he was still compelled to document a record of his people. So he gets into the Warsaw Ghetto. He's wearing a very thick overcoat, and under his overcoat he's hiding his camera, because if he had been viewed taking pictures in the Warsaw Ghetto, he would have been shot immediately. So he manages to integrate into this community and take this photograph. And this photograph has obsessed me since I was, I don't know, maybe 15 or 16 years old. It just deeply moved me, and I suppose ingrained in me what the power of photography is and was. So flash forward. I'm 5 years, 6 years. I managed to scrape some money to go to New York. As a kid, I was always obsessed with America. I thought America was this dream society that gives you hope. I was very frustrated by living in a country that was so class-ridden and obsessed with class and nonsense about, what did your father do? And, I felt very trapped, and America to me was a symbol of hope. So I get to America. The first day, I'm in New York. There was something back then called the Yellow Pages, and I don't know what possessed me. So I'm thumbing through the Yellow Pages, and I see this name, R. Vishniak. And I muster up the courage to call this number. So I call the number, this man in a very thick kind of Russian-German accent answers, yes, yes. And I tell him, Mr. Vishniak, you don't know me from Adam. I've just arrived in America. It's my first day in America. I was obsessed. I am obsessed with your book. Could I come and meet you? And he says to me, okay, I'm very, very busy, but I'll give you 10 minutes if you come tomorrow morning. So I take myself to the address he's given me. It's on Upper Broadway in the Ansonia building. And I push the bell, and I meet Mr. Vishniak. And for some reason, there was some kind of magical connection, and I end up spending maybe 6 or 7 hours with this man. And I never had any grandparents. I never knew them. There was something that I felt that this man was maybe the grandfather I'd never had or dreamed of. And his wife keeps bringing me food. It looked like for 6 hours I hadn't eaten. And she must have surmised I was starving. And so I meet this man, and I suppose at that age, it did another thing for me. It changed me in another way. So I get to meet the man who created the image that I was obsessed with. And that implanted something else in me. Okay, flash forward. I start a career making films, which is another difficult activity, if any of you can imagine. So I ended up producing a couple of small films in England. But the dream was always to maybe go to California, go to Hollywood. So I scrape up the money. I go to Hollywood. I go to California. I have a total net worth of $2,000. I have 3 pairs of jeans. I have 4 T-shirts. I meet someone, and she says, well, we're having dinner tonight with some friends at their house. Would you like to come with? So I go to this house, and the host is a photographer, and he was like, he did headshots, just very simple professional work, but he had a little collection. And on the wall, I'm looking at these images, and they're having a profound effect on me, especially this one. Because this one, from a poor boy from England who had aspirations to be a filmmaker, this resonated with me. This was Hollywood. This was a premiere. This was like all my dreams encapsulated into one frame. And it turned out that the host also collected vintage cars, and his wife said to him, well, you can't buy another vintage car until you sell some of these photos. I need a new kitchen, or whatever the kind of dialogue that was going on. And I timidly asked him, well, how much is this photograph? And he says to me, it's $400. Now, you've got to realize I've got a total net worth of $2,000. I'm driving a beat-up Pinto that really doesn't have any brakes on it. And any rational human being would have spent the $400 putting new brakes in his car rather than buying a piece of paper that he knew absolutely nothing about. But something compelled me, and buying this photo, I suppose, changed my life. I had become a collector. You know, I was like a mini J.P. Morgan, a mini, you know, Mr. Stewart or whatever, whoever, you know, the big shot collectors were. And this image sparked an interest in collecting photos and learning about the history of photography. I subsequently met the photographer, whose name was Max Chavno, who I loved. I thought he was an incredible man. He was had struggled all his life, as most photographers do. Very few photographers, very few creative people, be it in any field, actually make it. And he was kind of bitter, but I thought he was a great photographer. And so this was my first purchase. You know, I had this compulsion to learn everything about photography. And back when I started, there was a place in New York called the ICP, the International Center for Photography. And it was founded by a man called Cornell Capa, who was the younger brother of the famous Robert Capa, the war photographer. And Cornell had the most incredible eye, and he was the most incredible human being. And the ICP back then, when it was on Fifth Avenue, was my university. I was living in New York for a year, struggling, trying to make films. But the thing that saved me was going to the ICP. And they had a wonderful library, and they were very generous and sharing. And then I get to meet Cornell Capa a few years later when I left the film business and started my gallery. And he was one of my first real mentors, an extraordinary man. And I learned so much from being with him, talking to him, and seeing what he had created from nothing. And really, he had his taste. I mean, if you go to the ICP now, it's just completely different. I mean, I don't want to be critical, but I think Cornell might be turning in his grave. And so I wanted to do an exhibition with Cornell, and I felt very honored that he trusted me to do it, because he'd never had an exhibition of his own work. And we produced this beautiful book from him. And it was a wonderful experience at the end of his life for him. Because as the head of a museum, he never promoted his own work. His role was to sponsor and support every other photographer. And this is one of his beautiful photos of the Bolshoi Ballet. And he was the first Western photographer to be allowed into the Bolshoi Ballet to photograph them. Okay, so this is the next major moment in my life. This is a book called The Decisive Moment, which in my humble opinion is the greatest photo book ever produced. I've lived with it for, God knows, 45 years. I look at it every day. It still inspires me. So flash forward. I produced one of the worst movies ever made in the history of Hollywood. I'm totally, destroyed by it. I just don't know what to do with my life. And the great thing about your country is that you can reinvent yourself. So I went cold turkey from this insane business and started becoming a photography dealer. Out of the back of my rent-controlled apartment in California. And I was a bit like the Tupperware lady. I collected a few photos, and people used to host me on Sunday afternoons, and I'd go there like the Tupperware lady. I'd lay out, 5 or 6 photos. Maybe somebody would buy one, and then I would take the money on Monday morning and buy more photos because I became totally compulsive. And Cartier-Bresson, to me, was the god of photography. There was something about his imagery and the variety and the depth of it and the greatness of it that obsessed me. And I started to collect Henri's work. You have to understand, Henri was born into a very wealthy French textile family. So he had a little help. It's called a trust fund. But, most people who inherit trust funds often are destroyed by it. But he was not. And he had an agent in New York, an old girlfriend, I think. She was in her 70s, called Helen. And I used to call Helen up, and I used to, when I had some money, buy Cartier-Bresson photographs. Because I thought, my God, this man is Rembrandt. The fact that I can afford to buy a Cartier-Bresson photo was incomprehensible to me. And I wondered why my other colleagues in dealers weren't really showing his work. And the reason was because Henri couldn't care less about selling photos. He didn't need fame or money. He was the most famous photographer in the world and getting elderly and couldn't care less. But I became, by default, by de facto, his major dealer. And he was curious about this guy in California who's selling more photos for him than he's ever sold in his life. And nobody in Europe was buying his photographs. So I was due to go to Paris, and I wanted to meet him, and I was totally intimidated about meeting him. It's like if you were a painter and you were able to have an audience with Rembrandt. I mean, how do you deal with that psychologically? But Helen encouraged me. He said, Henri wants to meet you. His wife wants to meet you. You're going to Paris in 2 weeks. Call him. So that's what I did. And I remember the day so vividly. I'm standing outside his apartment, 137 Rue de Rivoli, overlooking the Tuileries. And I'm going like this, can't quite, too nervous to push the button. But I push it, and I'm entered in. I spend an afternoon with Henri and his wonderful wife, Martine Frank. And that meeting changed my life. We got on well, and he started to introduce me to other great French photographers who had created great work and really weren't recognized. So through Henri and Martine, I get to meet Robert Doisneau, Willy Ronis, Edouard Bouba, these extraordinary, great post-war photographers who had been overlooked. This is the key image by Martine Frank, who was a wonderful, wonderful photographer. It's very hard to be married to Henri Cartier-Bresson if you happen to be having the same profession. But she was an incredible woman. He was so lucky to have met her, and she was a great, great photographer. It's like being Mozart's son and you want to be a composer. It's very difficult when you've got that shadow hovering over you. So one day, Henri says to me, well, there's this young Brazilian photographer. I've just encouraged him to come into Magnum. I want you to meet him. I want you to protect him from the madness of the art world. I just think he needs some help. And that's how I met Sebastião Salgado, who sadly passed away a month ago. And I thought he was an extraordinary photographer. And we were, I think, really a big part of each other's lives for close to 40 years. We became his main gallery. I used to take him on tours in America. We'd go to museums. He was just an extraordinary force of life. And he would get up on the podium and there'd be a 10-minute standing ovation before he opened his mouth. So one of the great 20th century photographers. So to me, my life has been about meeting incredibly talented people. I mean, I think photographers are the greatest because they're artists, but they also live and deal with the real world. And they're not, sitting in their studio painting a flower. They're going out into the real world. And it takes an incredible dedication, personality, strength to do this work. So this is one of my favorite images from Salgado's last project called Amazonia. And he just spent so much time with these indigenous people. He would spend 5-6 weeks just integrating into their communities before he would take a shot. And that's one of the great photos next door. I think I realized you never escape your roots. So I was constantly going back to England, and I see this photograph, and it just puts a smile on my face. And I tracked down the photographer. Her name was Grace Robertson. And Grace was the tallest photographer I'd ever met in my life. She was about 6'4". And you have to realize, back in the 1950s in England, and I'm sure many other places, women weren't taken that seriously. It was a men's world in the working place. And this is a great story. So she had a beautiful portfolio, but couldn't get any work. So one day a little bell went off in her head, and she maybe realized why. So she dressed up as a man and went to the editor of a publication called Picture Post, which was the UK equivalent of Life magazine. So she dresses up as a guy, thick coat, shows the work to the editor. The editor loves the work, hires her on the spot. So this is like Tootsie. But the story of this is a group of working class women who once a year leave their domestic responsibilities behind them. They get rid of all the men. They have someone take care of the kids for the day. They hire a coach, a bus. They fill the bus up with food and booze. And as the day progresses, they get more and more inebriated. So working on Picture Post, there's another photographer called Thurston Hopkins. And Thurston realizes that Grace is actually a woman, their relationship develops and they fall in love and they get married. So it's Grace's birthday. And Thurston, like all great photographers, always has a camera on him. So he's going to a place called Harrods Food Hall, which is a very posh department store in Knightsbridge. How many of you have been to London and been to Harrods? Okay, so they have a great food hall. And because it's Grace's birthday, Thurston knows that she likes smoked salmon. So he's going into Harrods and he sees this. And it made me laugh, and it's so charming, and I call it the driving Miss Daisy shot, because you get this mental picture of the owner of the car and the driver and the dog. So they were just a wonderful, wonderful couple. I'm invited to the opening of Cartier-Bresson's foundation. This is a year before he passes away. And this picture is in the exhibition. And I find it very compelling and charming. And it turns out the photographer is a man called Pentti Samalati. and he is Finland's greatest photographer. He was given the equivalent of a Genius Award by the Finnish government. They said, we acknowledge you to be a great national artist, and we're going to give you a stipend for 25 years so you can give up teaching and just do your own work. And Henri said to me, well, he's a special man, but you'll never get an exhibition out of him because he couldn't care less about fame or money. So when someone tells me that, it becomes a challenge. And I go to Finland, and at the time, I came with a lot of cash. And I go to Pentti, and I meet him, and we're getting on. And he's the most beautiful, humble man I've ever met in my life. Totally pure. And I say to him, Pentti, everyone says you won't make an exhibition, you don't care, but I love your work. Will you do this for me? And I want to give you this money for the prints. And he's like, kind of, can't believe this may be happening. He says to me, Peter, I've never seen as much money in my life, because Finland is a great, great socialist country. And he says, I want to do this with you, but I don't want to do this. But I will do this because I'm going to take this money and I'm going to build my dream darkroom and studio. And he says to me, Peter, it's not mine, it's yours, and I'm calling it Peter's Studio. And like the tears are coming down nobody in my career has like ever said that. Sometimes when you're very successful for a photographer, it's like they want more and more out of you. But that's why, we connected, and he's one of the most extraordinary photographers in the world. And I'll tell you another story which will get my rancor up a little bit. We've done maybe 3 or 4 exhibitions with Pentti. And the last exhibition we did, in walks one of the most important curators of photography in the world. He comes in, he says, there's 80 prints up. It's very hard to do an exhibition of a photographer, with a couple of exceptions, where each one of the 80 prints is greater than the next. He says, I've never seen such extraordinary work. Who is he? Tell me about him. So I tell him about him. And I say to him, well, he just had an exhibition in Arles. It was lines around the block. Why don't you be the first US museum to give Pentti an exhibition? He said, Peter, that's such a great idea. Yes, we'll do it. And he says to me the following, how much are the prints? And I say, well, they range from $1,200 to $2,500. And his face goes ashen, and he's like going crazy. And I think, you okay? Do you need some water? He said, Peter, we can't do an exhibition in our museum when the prices of the art are so low. And then, this is the insanity of the art world. So I'm so happy I'm here in a wonderful museum that doesn't have that mindset. So thank you, Kevin. But that's an object lesson. And to me, coming from my background, going on again, that, I'd love to have a collection of Mondigliani photo paintings, but I don't have a spare, $80 million under the bed. So the attraction for photography is that it's still an affordable medium. You can own the same print that the Getty Museum owns. So that's why I believe in photography, on a purely pragmatic, practical level as well. So I'm in Finland with Pentti, and I say to him casually, is there anyone else good in Finland who's a great photographer? He said, well, there's this one man, and he was my chief student, and I think you should meet him. So, this is in the middle of winter. We drive, 5 hours in the freezing cold through forests, and we get to this man's house, Christopher Albrecht. And I walk into his house, and I see this image on the wall, and it totally seduces me. So collecting is all personal, autobiographical, and we subsequently started to work with Christopher. And I just think this is one of the most beautiful, tender images I've ever come across. So, I'm lucky that I'm always open and hunting and looking for more images. I meet Steve McCurry like 35 years ago, and Steve, like Sebastião Salgado, like Cartier-Bresson, has this fire within him, and he's constantly searching and driven and caring. And this is one of the probably most iconic 20th century photos, called Afghan Girl. And I noticed it's reproduced in the front of the museum, Kevin. So, an incredible photo. And however many times you've seen it on the cover of National Geo or in books, when you physically stand next to it, as you will shortly, it really does have a power. I'm back in London, and in London there's one of the early, probably I think she was the first female photographer to be invited to join Magnum, which was really kind of like a boys' club. But Eve was tiny. She was like 4'10", but so feisty and had an incredible streak of determination. And she befriended Malcolm X and had complete access to him. And I'm interested in history. And for me, as a collector, I always wanted to learn something when I acquired a photo. So this was my introduction to trying to understand racial issues in this country. I get fired up and I want to produce an exhibition about civil rights, which as an English guy still to this day amazes me how this major issue is still so important and so relevant, and so the struggle still goes on to get people to live together. So I'm researching, and you can't do an exhibition about civil rights without a great picture of MLK. So I'm looking through hundreds of pictures, and I see this one, and I end up meeting the photographer Dan Budnick. So this image was taken 5 seconds after MLK had given I Have a Dream speech. And Dan is on the floor shooting up. And to me, this is the greatest portrait of MLK I've ever seen. And Dan was crazy and wonderful and very difficult to deal with, as a lot of creative people are, but he had a really great talent. So we supported him for many years. So I'm interested in history, and I came across this really large, rare platinum print of Lincoln, and the person who had it was asking so much money for it. But as a hunter, gatherer, collector, I was going to mortgage my house or whatever. I said, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to acquire a rare image of this in this size, of such power and beauty. So, you eat sandwiches for 3 weeks. You don't go out to a nice dinner. Whatever it takes, you try to find the money to buy what you're obsessed with. And I'm so glad I stretched to do this, because it's one of the great photos in the exhibition, which I will never find another one of. I love Edward Curtis's work, and this is a particularly beautiful orotone. So the image is printed on glass, and many of the ones that survived are all cracked and scratched. But there again, you come across something that is the quality of the actual physical object. And that's what collecting is about, and developing your connoisseurship and developing your eye. So there again, I had to have it. I met Ruth RBG accidentally, staying at the same place she was staying in New York. And I thought she was an extraordinary woman and had a wonderful conversation with her. And then I wanted to find a great RBG photo. And there again, I did a lot of research and found this one, taken by Nikki Khan, who was on staff at the time for the Washington Post. So I think it's an extraordinary, powerful image of this tiny, incredibly powerful woman in one of the most important buildings in America. So it got to me. You know, I remember the day, and I'm sure many of you in the audience do, when JFK was killed. And I thought this said it all in just a simple frame. And Carl Meidens was one of the chief photographers for Life magazine. So I suppose I'm attracted to images that move me. Here again, another great political photograph. This is RFK's funeral train, the train that carried his body from New York to Arlington. And all along the way, people stood out of respect as the train passed through their communities. There again, I think one of the great political photos. And there, of course, is the great Winston Churchill, and taken by Mr. Karsh, Canada's probably most prominent photographer. And I just love the image, and I love the story. So it's during the war. Churchill is invited to Ottawa to speak to the Parliament to raise interest and support. So he gives this incredible speech, and the Canadian authorities want to commemorate the occasion by having Mr. Churchill's photo taken. And Mr. Churchill doesn't want to have his photo taken. All he wants to do is get out of there. He's given a great speech. He's raised a lot of money, interest. He just wants to jump on his plane and go home and save the world. But they're insistent he has his photo taken. So they've asked Mr. Karsh to set up the lights, the camera, in an antechamber, and Churchill's just refusing to have his photo. I've got more important things to do. I don't need this. I got to go. I got to go. And they force him to do it. He kind of like caves in. So he walks into the antechamber where Mr. Karsh is waiting for him. And he's got a big fat cigar in his mouth. And he sits down and he's kind of growling at Mr. Karsh. And Mr. Karsh doesn't want to take the most important man in the world's photo with a big, fat, ugly cigar in his mouth. So he goes up to him and says, "Excuse me, sir," takes it out of his mouth. And then Churchill kind of gives him a little smile. So that's how this photo came to be. So we need Churchill back, you know, a good world leader, right? Complicated man, but, you know, had charisma. Okay, this is my queen, Queen Elizabeth. So I meet this photographer in London called David Montgomery, who was an American who came to London in the 60s. And I just love this photo because this is the Queen of England. You would think that the Queen of England has a big household staff. So she's sitting next to a $25 CVS electric heater, as opposed to having her staff make her a beautiful log fire. And I love this image. And we have corgis. We have a corgi. And one day I come home, and my wife seems very sad. And I say to her, "Well, what's the matter? Why do you look so sad?" "Well, I just heard that the Queen's favorite corgi just died. And if that ever happened to me, I would be so sad." And I said to her, "Why don't you send the Queen a condolence note?" And she said, "How do I do that? How do I do this?" I say, "Your Royal Highness, care of Buckingham Palace, London SW1. So she writes a very beautiful, heartfelt note of condolence to the Queen of England. And 6 months later, we get a letter from the Queen saying, "Thank you so much. Your note meant so much to me." So as an Englishman who's so like appalled at Brexit and the kind of madness of English behavior, it gave me a little bit of hope that this country where I was born still has something like that. A little magical gesture can still happen. Great photo. I've always loved fashion photography. I think it's an underrated great art. And I had the good fortune to meet Lillian Bassman, who in the 50s was one of the great fashion photographers. And she was a colleague of Penn and Avedon, but because she was a woman and they were such careerists and she was bringing up children, she wasn't the driven force that those guys were. But her work, I thought, and do think still, was incredible. And I became friendly with Lillian. And every time I flew into New York, I would go directly from JFK and spend half an hour with Lillian in her studio, because she would be still working, whatever time of day or night it would be. And she was such an inspiration. And she passed away when she was 94 and was working till the day she died. And I wanted to be around people like that all my life. And fortunately, I've been able to do that. But an extraordinary force of nature as well. Same thing here. This is taken by Sabine Weiss, who I met her when she was like in her 80s and still working away. And one day I picked her up because she had a book signing, and she was, I think, 90 at the time. I picked her up. I took her to the museum where the signing was, and she spent 6.5 hours at the age of like 94 personalizing every single book, talking to everybody. And what another incredible force of nature. And this to me is her greatest image. I don't think it would be an image if it wasn't shot in the rain. This is taken by Sarah Moon, a great friend of Lillian Bassman, and to my mind, the greatest living fashion photographer. If you're a fashion designer, you will wait in line for for Sarah to shoot your campaign. And she's 83, 84 now. Extraordinary, extraordinary woman. One of the great artists, pure artists. Whenever I go and see her in Paris, I leave so inspired. She lives in this beautiful little house in the middle of Paris, and you think you could be in an English country garden where Lewis Carroll worked. Another great fashion photographer, Frances McLaughlin Gill. You know, as a kid growing up, you know, we were all in love with Audrey Hepburn. And this is taken by a great English fashion photographer, Norman Parkinson. When I first saw this photo, I thought this just blew me away. It's taken by William Klein. And it's in a Turkish bath in Paris. And I just love the attitude in this photo, you know. Don't be judgmental. This is who we are. To hell with you. I think it's one of the great kind of Fellini-esque images. This is an incredible photograph. I met this man, William Hike. He lived in San Francisco. And this was taken in Seattle in 1951. And all these men, it's Father's Day, and they're having a hard time, and they're down on their luck. But once a year, this group of amazing people treat them to a great day, and they hire a bus, and they fill the bus with food, and they all gather together. And whatever state of their lives are, they've managed to hang on to their dignity, and through the expression of the hat. And the point I'm trying to make is, you know, my dad had a hat like that, and he had a tough life. And so, all autobiographical. I think, you know, Kevin's made a great job of 120 images all over the place. How do you make them flow? How do you tell the story? How do you connect them? And I think it's a simple fact that we're all drawn to images that bring some kind of personal connection to our own life story. And I suppose seeing this image when I saw it, the day I saw it, reminded me of my dad and his hat. That's why it's here. This is an image by Manuel Alvarez Bravo, who, the great Mexican photographer. I got to meet him in his 90s. Extraordinary, poetic man. And I just love images of ambiguity. I don't know what this image is really about, but it doesn't matter to me. I'm just touched by it. I'm moved by it. I love the title, What a Small World. I don't know what's going on. Do they know each other? Are they going to connect? It's just one of life's poetic moments, and he was a wonderful, poetic, beautiful photographer. Here again, autobiographical. I'd had my first child, so I was very conscious of being a father for the first time, and that emotional story that fathers go through at the beginning, always, I think. And there was just this primal connection to this image. And here again, I don't know what's going on. It doesn't matter. And the title, Navigation Without Numbers, is what's written on the board on the right-hand side. But it just moved me, and I had to possess this print. And Win Bullock was one of the great West Coast photographers. You know, the same generation, Ansel Adams, Edward Weston, never quite got the recognition I thought he deserved. So I've always been a champion of his work. And the print is so physically beautiful when you see it outside. This is Highway 1, which I'm sure many of you have driven. And I think it's the greatest photo of Highway 1 I've ever seen. And it was taken by a man called Henry Gilpin, who was actually the chief police cop of Carmel. But he befriended all, Ansel and everybody else, and they respected him. And this is just a beautiful, beautiful print. This is taken by John Dominis, an important Life magazine photographer. And there again, becoming a parent is a big deal in one's life. And I thought this was the greatest expression of parenthood and being a dad that I had come across. And, I went crazy. I went berserk and just bought as many prints as I could of this image because it moved me so much. This is taken by a Swiss photographer called René Grubli, and there's a beautiful photo book called The Eye of Love. And I thought René had passed away many years ago, but I'm in Paris and I meet him, and I can't believe he's still alive because I tried to track him down, and then we became friends. And he's now, I think, 96 or 97, but still feisty and wears colored shoes like me, and just an incredibly inspirational man. And this is like a love poem to his wife. They're staying in a little cheap pension in Paris on their honeymoon. They have no money, but it's like a novella. It's one of the most beautiful photo books. I urge you to seek it out. It's called The Eye of Love. This is, we try to work with some interesting younger photographers. This is a young South African photographer, and she did a series of drum majorettes, and these are all really poor kids from terrible backgrounds, and they come together and they become part of this community, and it gives them so much self-respect and hope, and incredibly joyous photo. This is my favorite image of Willy Rony, who Cartier-Bresson introduced me to. As a great lover of Paris, it's just the light and the composition And Willie was one of the most extraordinary, humble people I've met. I was going to give him his 100th birthday party in Paris, but sadly he passed away 6 weeks before his 100th birthday. And that was very selfish of him because we were all looking forward to it. But I think if you're a photographer, you're going to live a long, long life. So the photographers in the room, you're in good shape. I think you're doing good things for your health. You know, my saddest regret is I never got to meet André Cortez, one of my photographic heroes, and actually Cartier-Bresson was totally in awe of him. And it's just the simplicity and the power of his work. And this to me was his last great photo. It's like a man looking back on his life and trying to make sense of it. An incredibly moving photo. And this was taken by a man called John Salkowski, who was one of my mentors, one of the greatest curators ever, and also an incredible photographer. But because he was the head of the photography department at MoMA in New York, he never promoted his work. But we became very friendly, and we did the last exhibition ever of his work, and he came with us he spent a week with us in the gallery, and just the most incredible man. And every Monday morning he used to come to MoMA and bring his staff apples that he had grown, and he was a champion of so many great photographers, including Cortez. And John told me the story one day. In walks, it's Friday night, it's kind of late, this guy in a kind of old raincoat carrying a few shopping bags, somehow gets past security, walks into MoMA, walks into John's office, and John thinks this man is like a homeless man who's just walked in. Who is he? And then he realized who he was, and Cortez had been forgotten, basically. And then John opens the shopping bag, sees these incredible prints, and gives him a one-man show at MoMA, which totally resurrected his career. So there's a lot of wheels within wheels here for me. And this is one of the great images of childhood. It's by Robert Doisneau, and it's a carousel. And you don't see any children in it, but to me, it was the essence of being a child. And there again, if it would have been shot at sunshine, there'd be no image. Just incredibly. This is personal, again. My first car growing up in England was a Morris Minor. And this is England in the height of summer. And, you know, England summers are usually about 5 days. So there's this couple on vacation. It's freezing cold outside, it's raining, but this is their vacation. And I think it's just a beautiful, tender photo taken by an extraordinary Italian photographer who's completely under the radar, Gianni Berengo Gardan, who's 95 years old now, an extraordinary, great photographer. You know, I'm a Dylan fan, so we did a big Bob Dylan exhibition, and this is early Dylan. He looks like Byron. There again, this is, you know, I love music, so you'll see a lot of music images in the show. This is the night Bruce Springsteen was discovered. He's opening for Bonnie Raitt in Boston, and in the audience is a guy called John Landau, who's the chief music critic for Rolling Stone, and John writes this article about Bruce saying he's the future of rock and roll. So his life was changed that night by the fact that that guy was there who wrote that article, who subsequently became his manager. You know, whenever I kind of get beaten down by the world, I look at this photo and it gives me the extra mileage to go fight the good fight. So the genius of this image is that Neil Leifer thought the action, he was the only photographer in the room that sensed that maybe the action would be on this side of the ring. So you see all these other photographers so angry and jealous of him that he got the shot and they didn't. And this guy here with the glasses and the bald head, he came into the gallery once and he was so angry. He was so angry I had that photo up on the wall and he was telling me the story. You know, that guy Leifer, I hate him. I think we're ending on this shot. I'm a terrible, tortured romantic, and this to me is one of the most beautiful photos I've ever seen, most tender photo of a man taking a portrait of his wife. And this is by the great Emmett Gowan, and this is his wife, Edith. And that's it. So thank you.